Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, you are recording today's episode not next to me because someone in your family has gastro. Now, given the trends of the internet, does vitamin D fix that? It seems to fix absolutely everything.
Oh, unfortunately, no. I tell you what, if I had vitamin D to fix gastro, I'd be dousing myself in it and in a bath and everything. So no. It is very good, but not that good. So yes, we're talking about vitamin D today. And look, if we look through history, we see vitamin D is the life giver. And we look around the world, vitamin D, the sun. The sun with everything is the giver of life. And through most human history, we've actually worshipped the sun. If you look at ancient Egypt, they had the creator of everything was Ra, and you had the Norse sun god Sol, and she rode her chariot through the sky, being chased by an evil wolf called Scroll. And you had the Hittite, the Hindu, Aztec. If you look at any of the ancient civilizations, they realized the importance of the sun. And the amazing thing about it is we learning how useful it is to this day. And we will discuss this more with our guests, but look, just a bit of background. When we look at vitamin D, we get vitamin D from two main sources. The majority comes actually from the sun, and that's what we call vitamin D3. And the other source comes from dietary vitamin D2. And when that comes into our system, it goes into our bloodstream, goes to the liver, where it's processed by an enzyme called 25-OHAs. And that converts it into something that we'll mention a fair bit. We'll get used to it. It's called 25-OHD. Now, that's actually what we test. When we're testing for your vitamin D, we're testing that chemical, that molecule. And so that gives us pretty much the baseline of what your vitamin D level is.
Travis, before you go any further, sorry to interrupt your flow, but there are two things that come together here. 25 is also the number of this episode. I'm sure you plotted that on purpose. But secondly, the fact that we can get the vitamin D3 from the sun, do you think from your historical research that they knew that back in ancient times, or was it more symptomatic that you seem to have better health having been in the sun?
I think they would have linked probably someone who is unwell, staying in the dark, getting pale, not feeling well, with someone who goes out, get outside, see some sun, get the sun, feel the goodness that comes from the sun. Now, they also would have associated that with a God giving a blessing and sharing it too. So they may not have known it directly, but they would have known it was good for them. And that's right. Yeah, the 25-OHD is absolutely good for it, and it's essential. And so when it's in our bloodstream and it's at that level, 25-OHD, it then goes to the kidneys where it's converted by another enzyme called 1-OHAs, and that forms it into its active form, which is 1,25-OH2D. So don't worry about that. All these numbers are sounding letters. It's all sounding a bit of alphabet soup. But the importance of the active form is it starts to do all the physiological effects.
Right.
And this is when you get that active form, it stimulates the stomach, the gastrointestinal system, to increase calcium absorption and phosphate. It also inhibits our parathyroid hormone, which, when the parathyroid hormone is active, uses other stimulants for our bone cells, osteoblasts and osteoclasts, to reabsorb calcium because we need more of it. So what ends up happening is all of this works in conjunction. So if you've got lots of vitamin D, you then absorb a lot more calcium and phosphate, and your body's ready to use it. If you don't have it, then what ends up happening is it will then cause the body to reabsorb some of its own bone to increase calcium. And so that's how it kind of holds this homeostasis that we have. And so it's this balance. So if we don't have enough, well, we start to use some of the body's stores of calcium and phosphate. And so that's really important for what's going through when we're looking at vitamin D. Understand that, and then you can actually understand the pathway of what happens when we don't have enough.
Well, I'm glad I take my espresso out in the sun whenever there's a bit of sun shining.
You're doing a beautiful job then, Steve.
And there's a homeostasis there because it's enriching with more calcium, and I believe that the coffee rips calcium out of my system, so I don't want to have too much.
So it's all a balancing act as we're learning. But look, when we look at vitamin D, when we start to understand, now these are really, well, one's really rare, but we can get two diseases associated with vitamin D. And the first one is rickets, and the second one is osteomalacia. Now we're going to talk about these in turn, noting that this is about vitamin D. And look, rickets is exceedingly rare nowadays. We just don't see it really. And the difference between the two is when you actually have your deficiency. And so rickets occurs in bones that have not finished growing. So this is in children.
Yep.
Osteomalacia is caused in adults. And in adults, this is because the growth plates have closed. And this will actually be a little bit of a key to working out, well, how does this pathology work? So when we look at rickets, what we say is this occurs when growth plates are open. So what happens? Well, we have chondrocytes. So they're the cells of the cartilage. And they, to get something bigger and longer, they proliferate. And what we say, they become hypertrophied, so they become larger. And then cartilage accumulates and expands. So if you think about a bone, if you're wanting it to grow, well, you're going to need part of it to grow, and that's initially cartilage. And over time, what happens is that cartilage then converts or becomes calcified or calcification in the growth plate. And it becomes also vascularized, and that's how you get blood going through it. If you don't have enough vitamin D, these chondrocytes become disorganized. They lose this nice columnar orientation and they become thicker. And so if you can think of it, instead of elongating, they actually become wider and nodular. And so the growth plate expands, but it's abnormal. And in children, this rickets, what ends up happening, they become swollen. The growth plates become nodular and the bone stability is compromised. That causes the bones to bow. And so this is why you get this. If you ever look at someone with rickets, they look like they've got sort of stumpy kind of limbs, and their bones are bowed, bent. And so it often happens in the distal forearm, the knee, or even in the costochondral joints and the ribs. And so they'll get a widening of the wrist, the distal radius and ulna, and they'll get progressive bowing of the femur. And so we always, like when we look at this disease, it's actually been with us, but it came to prominence in the Industrial Revolution. And it's thought because of the increased pollution, the reduced sunlight exposure, and the increase in job indoors and factories and underground work, that this word rickets first comes to light. The word rickets is first seen in handwritten recipe books in 1632, and this was written as remedies for rickets in children. And so they were trying to see, they saw this pathology happening in their children. They couldn't work out why, and so they thought, okay, it's a nutritional deficiency. And there is an increase in death certificates, although it's interesting because we actually don't know what they're referring to when they say rickets. It might be something completely different.
Well,
But
what's one of the recipes? Do you remember what one of the recipes were?
no, they just referred to them as a whole bunch of recipes in these books of rickets for children and remedies.
There is some homework to see if we can get a recipe for the show notes.
Oh, there we go. We need to get some. And so the interesting thing about this is we actually don't know where this word rickets come from. Some people think it's Dorset from the word called rucket, which means to breathe with difficulty, because again, the chest was affected, so it wasn't as expansive, or it was a little bit bent in the wrong way, and so these people had difficulty breathing. But there was also an Anglo-Saxon word, ricken, which means to twist. And so it's not quite sure. And they even tried to change it in the literature, but rickets just stuck. And the first clear description of rickets comes from Glisson, Bate, and Regimortar in 1650. And this was translated to mean concerning rickets.
The head bigger than ordinary, and the face fat and in good constitution in respect of other parts. About the joints, especially the wrists and ankles, certain swellings are conspicuous. The articles and joints and the habits of all the external parts are less firm and rigid, and more flexible than at another time they are observed in dead bodies. The breast outwardly lean, and very narrow, especially under the arms, and seemeth on the side to be, as it were, compressed. The sternum is somewhat pointed, like the keel of a ship or the breast of a hen. The top of the ribs, to which the stern is conjoined with gristles, or costal cartilages, are knotty.
So this is the first real good description of rickets. And look, this isn't, again, a podcast about rickets because we just don't see it. And that's such a classical kind of striking description that they give. But the one thing we may come across is this osteomalacia. So people who have vitamin D deficiency who are adults. Now, this is after the growth plates are fused. But remember, bone is constantly turning over. We think of bone as a rigid structure, but it is constantly turning over. And a good example of this is when we break a bone. So if you think about it, the bone heals up, depending on how old, about 4 to 6 weeks. But that is the bone just remodeling itself. It will reabsorb and it will then come out, form osteoid and then harden up. That is just a good example of bone turnover. And so when we have vitamin D deficiency, the osteoid that I refer to, it reduces the ability at that site for the bone turnover. The vitamin D that impairs the calcium that then deposits and gets our strength in our bones. Now, a lot of this is asymptomatic. So people will see, or they'll have an X-ray for some reason, and it will be identified radiologically that, there is some deficiency. It's actually very translucent. And so that's one way that we can pick up osteomalacia. But if people do have symptoms, the main symptom they get is pain. They'll get pain in their bones and hips. About 94% of people who have osteomalacia and are symptomatic will have pain. They can also have bony tenderness. About 88 to 90% of people will have bony tenderness. They may just get a fracture, even from just a really simple, what we call a non-traumatic incident. They can have difficulty walking and muscle spasms. And so when we're looking at the pain, where's the pain? Well, the pain happens mainly in the lower spine, in the pelvis, and the lower extremities. And this pain is described as a dull, aching kind of just ache. And it is aggravated by activity and weight bearing. And so when we look at the fractures, these occur often in the ribs or in the vertebrae or the long bones. And if we've got prolonged severe deficiency of vitamin D, you can get spine curvature and deformity of the thorax and pelvis. And this is probably very severe. But again, it's not in the general community, but it will probably be someone who's had vitamin D deficiency for years, and you start to get that impact. So when we're looking at the tests, if we just have a quick scan, the majority of the people will have an elevated ALP. Now, that's alkaline phosphatase. We get that coming from a bony source. So what you find is when they've got vitamin D, you start to leach the calcium and the phosphate out of your bones to try and increase the amount, because you're not absorbing as much. A lot of people will have reduced calcium and phosphate, about a third of the cases, and they almost certainly will have low urinary calcium because your body is trying to absorb as much calcium as they can. So you're trying not to get rid of it. They will certainly have severe deficiency in vitamin D and an elevated PTH. So one of the questions I'll ask our guests coming up is whether we always test PTH, vitamin D, and calcium together. Now, again, I'll just reiterate, the diseases we've talked about, rickets is exceedingly rare. So we just don't see it these days. Osteomalacia happens at about 1 in 1,000. Now, the importance of this is some people, that's just a straight out figure, 1 in 1,000. Some people are more at risk than others. And again, we're going to discuss who we need to target to find out whether they have this vitamin D deficiency.
And you've also described the healing of bones so wonderfully. I've never broken one. So maybe I should try that to enjoy the wonder of the healing body, Travis?
Well, we always like to go the extra yard here, Steve. So if you want me, I'll bring a sledgehammer around next time. Go misery style.
Perfect. I love your bedside manner. Professor Ken Sikaris is a chemical pathologist and director of chemical pathology at Melbourne Pathology. Professor Sikaris is a NATA-accredited laboratory assessor, founding fellow of the RCPA Faculty of Science, and a principal examiner in pathology informatics. He's a fellow of the Department of Pathology at the University of Melbourne as well. Professor Ken Sikaris, a regular guest on this Medical Life podcast, and we welcome you again. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Steve. Nice to be back.
Yes, this time it's the topic of vitamin D, and I wonder if we could just start with the basics. What can you tell us about the different sources of vitamin D?
Yeah, well, it is of clinical interest. So you can get vitamin D from either plant material, like let's say mushrooms, or from animal material, and virtually all animal material, meat and offal and so on, has vitamin D in it. Now, they're slightly different because the plant source is from a molecule called ergosterol, and it's very much like cholesterol or cholesterol in animals, but ergosterol performs the same function. It sort of helps to stiffen up the cell membrane. And so in animals, you have this ergosterol. In animals, you have cholesterol. Now, both of them can be, there's this particular form of cholesterol, 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is damaged by UV light. And the damage of the UV light converts the 7-dehydrocholesterol to cholecalciferol. So cholesterol to cholecalciferol. And similarly, the damage by light to ergosterol converts ergosterol to ergocalciferol. Now, they're usually, people don't use those terms. Usually they talk about vitamin D3 as being from the animal source and vitamin D2 being from the plant source. So look, one of the really interesting things that people don't realise, I mean, vegans like to have things not from animal sources. So you can get irradiated mushrooms and fungi that have the vitamin D2, the ergocalciferol. But most of the time, people are taking cholecalciferol or vitamin D3 from animal sources.
Oh.
But look, this is really fascinating. It's like when you say So you're not vegan. So what part of the animal did the calciferol come from? And it's really because Australia is one of the highest producers of vitamin D3 in supplements. Australia and New Zealand, which gives you a bit of a hint of where it's coming from. If I could say this little story, because it really gives you a lot of information about this UV source. So how do furry animals get their vitamin D made if the UV can't hit their skin where the thing is? So how do they get it made? And the interesting thing is that they secrete oils onto the hair of their fur, and the oil gets irradiated. That's where the cholesterol is formed. And then they lick their fur, like animals, and they lick the fur and they ingest that vitamin D. So if we could only get a lot of animal fur oil and irradiate it, we would have a great way of making animal D3. So and the source is, if you haven't guessed it already, it's lanolin. Irradiated lanolin is the source of vitamin D3 in our tablets.
I thought the source might have been for those of us with a cowlick.
That's right. It's harder for us to lick our hair, though.
Actually, and just one other thing, with mushrooms, many of them grown in the dark these days, not even touching the sun, but still a source of vitamin D for these other reasons.
No, well, they have to be irradiated with the specific UV light or other forms of radiation to convert. Yeah, that's right. It would be low in vitamin, just like low lanolin, if it wasn't irradiated, would be low in vitamin D.
So then looking at the sources, are both of them equal? Can you get as much from dietary sources as you can from sunlight? Is one better than the other?
Yeah, look, it is possible to get it from dietary sources, but typically we don't. We only get about 10 or 20% max of our vitamin D from diet. If you look at supplemented milk, it might have about 50 or 100 units of vitamin D, and we need 100 units a day, 1,000 units a day. So 100 from, a litre of milk. How many litres of milk do you have to drink to get to 1,000? It's like 10 litres, and that's sort of fortified milk. So it's virtually impossible to get your daily requirement from just diet, unless that diet includes vitamin D capsules. So that's one of the important things. So vitamin D, the first part of its misnomer is that it's a vitamin, coming from food. It's not. It's a vitamin that comes from sunlight.
Mm-hmm. So when we're actually testing this vitamin D, we're testing 25-OHD. Now, why are we testing that one and not the active source, the 125-OH2D?
Yeah, well, the cholecalciferol is not even 25-hydroxylated. It's the provitamin. So when that's absorbed from the skin or from the diet, it's quickly 25-hydroxylated by the liver, and there's no control on that. As much vitamin D as you have, the liver will 25-hydroxylate it. So the 25-hydroxy vitamin D is equivalent to how much vitamin D you're taking in. The 125-hydroxylation of vitamin D, the 1-hydroxylation of vitamin D is controlled by the body, controlled by PTH, controlled by your need for vitamin D. And it's much, much lower in concentration than the 25-hydroxy vitamin D. The other thing is the 125-hydroxy D can be down-regulated, like you can't 1-hydroxylating kidney disease when you've got because that's the major organ of 1-hydroxylation. So in renal failure, it looks like you've got no vitamin D. I mean, not because you're not making it, but you can't 1-hydroxylate it. So it's affected by renal function. There's other sort of inflammatory conditions, granulomas and sarcoidosis. Those collections of cells tend to 1-hydroxylate vitamin D. It's got nothing to do with the availability of vitamin D. It's just got to do with sort of a pathological change. So 125 has its own regulators and pathological modifiers, whereas 25 is a direct reflection of your exposure to vitamin D.
Mm-hmm. So then if we're looking at biological variation, how will this change from day to day, this level?
That's a really interesting question. It doesn't really change much from day to day. The variation in your vitamin D, if you measured vitamin D today and tomorrow in hundreds of people, it would vary by about 5% from one day to the next. So very little. But if you'd measured it in summer and in winter, the changes, well, it depends on where you live. So it really is determined by how many sunlight hours you have and the quality of that sunlight, the UV content of that sunlight. So in Australia, sunny Queensland, perfect one day,
Yes.
there's not much variation in the amount of sunlight. So in the summer, there's 20% more, equivalent sunlight than in the winter. Whereas in Tasmania, there's 40% less sunlight in the winter. And so similarly, vitamin D levels are always higher in the summer, but they're lower. They're lower even in Queensland in the winter and very, very much lower in Tassie in the winter. In Melbourne and Adelaide, where we are, the sunlight in summer is about 8 or 9 hours per day, whereas in the winter it's like 3 or 4 hours a day. So, and it's not just that, it's also to do with the UV content of that sunlight. And because the sun is lower on the horizon in the winter, there's less UV. Like how long would it take you to get a sunburn in the winter? It's like forever. Like you're very unlikely to get sunburn in the winter because of the poor UV content of light, even though it's both less in content and less in quality as far as vitamin D is concerned.
And I recall I spent 2 years living in Budapest, and from about November and through to about March, it was deeply overcast and freezing, and people actually have psychological issues and depression as a result, but there's possibly quite a lot of vitamin D deficiency happening.
Yeah, look, I've forgotten the name of the Greek ancient traveller who travelled to Scandinavia, and he sort of concluded that those people are just depressed all the time. Like, so now, but there's some real interesting evolutionary history there because, the human race lost their melanin, the Caucasians, let's say, lost their ability to pigment their skin only about, tens of thousands of years ago. And it was when humans migrated to north, towards the pole, Scandinavia or even South America or even the Southern Australia, the Indigenous people of Southern Australia had much fairer skin than Indigenous people of Northern. So we've evolved to have less pigment in the skin so we can absorb more of that scarce UV light in those dark places. And one of the things that's been well described in clinical research is that when people with darker skins migrate to dark places like Scandinavia or Melbourne, they have big troubles in generating enough vitamin D.
So, look, it's fascinating stuff. But can I ask, with regards to the level of vitamin D and pretty much vitamin D deficiency?
Yeah.
Because the level seems to be a little bit fluid as to what it is vitamin D deficiency. Can you give us some numbers that we need to be familiar with for this?
Yeah, well, you're right, Travis, because there's no threshold where you're suddenly vitamin D. It's a continuum, and the continuum, as far as research can tell us, is that your risk starts to rise at about 50 nanomole per litre once it drops below 50. And then in Australia, we've sort of classified, mild, moderate and severe deficiency. So 50 is mild deficiency. Once you hit 30, it's moderate deficiency. And once you hit 12.5, it's severe deficiency. But that continuum sort of shows that as your vitamin D level drops below those levels, your calcium level starts to fall. It may not be abnormal, but it's lower than the average should be. Your alkaline phosphatase or your bone activity starts to rise. Your parathyroid hormone levels start to rise because you're not going to get enough calcium, so you're going to, take some out of the bank deposit of your bones. So, it's a continuum, but they're the figures that we have: 50 for mild, 30 for moderate, and 12.5 for severe. But there's an important addendum to that interpretation because, as I said, it's different in summer and winter. So does 50 refer to the summer level or the winter level? And effectively, it works to the winter level. So to be 50 at the end of winter in Melbourne, you need to be above, let's say, 75 in the summer. So, and similarly, if you're aiming to not drop below 50 in the winter in Brisbane, or you might be safer with 60 or 65 in the summer, at the end of summer. So, it's hard to be hard and fast. And for laboratories, it's very hard because whilst it's already confusing enough to interpret vitamin D levels with mild, moderate, and severe. If we had different levels, cutoffs, depending on the season, well, then, we'd be confusing most clinicians and most patients with how many cutoffs we've got.
Yeah. So then looking at that level, then who is at the greatest risk of vitamin D deficiency if we were to target people?
Yeah, we've done some recent research on vitamin D levels. We did it with the Oz-Diab cohort. There was a group of patients recruited in 1999 and followed over 10 or 20 years. And we looked at what were the determinants of vitamin D there. And certainly if you're older, if you're overweight, if you're in a nursing home, all of the things which really mitigate sunlight exposure are related to vitamin D risk. Yeah, they're the major. Now, there are some other determinants that we think about, like wearing, traditional clothing that covers up all your skin will reduce your sunlight exposure. But in a way, one of the things that's important to realise, what I said before, like it's the summer level that determines how low you drop in the winter. In the summertime, when there's so much UV, most people, if they just go out in the bare sun in summer, will burn in an hour, most Caucasians. So if you don't have sun pigment and tanning in your skin. So really it's to do with, how you behave in the summertime and whether you access the summer sunlight that determines how low your winter nadir is going to be. And so all of those things, sort of being inactive and overweight or in an institutionalized or nursing home or completely covering up or avoiding the sunlight in the summer, are really what determines your risk of vitamin D deficiency. If I can say one thing there, I had a student from the Middle East, and she did a study of vitamin D levels in the Middle East. And really, she may have been trying to prove that, wearing traditional clothing, doesn't really cause you harm. But what she did find was that, the people in the Middle East who have a terrible high rate of vitamin D deficiency, even though they have like 12 hours of sunlight every day. What she found was they were exposed to something like less than 10 minutes of sunlight a day. They went, it's pretty hot there. They went from air-conditioned homes and offices. They might have had to walk to the car. And then once you're in the car, the glass blocks the UV as well. So the amount of sunlight they're actually exposed to is very little. Now, there are sort of cultural overlays there. A lot of cultures, dark skin is seen to be a sign of the agricultural workers, the lower classes. And so, you want to have fairer skin because you look, more affluent and so on. But, people just don't avoid the sun. And, so there are cultural as well as those, clinical risk factors.
So then if we're looking at patients and we're looking at symptoms, we have discussed some of this being pain or fractures. Is there any that you would highlight for GPs in either the mild or moderate to severe range that should flag I need to test vitamin D in this patient?
Mild is really asymptomatic, and it's really whilst you might argue that, you need to screen because there's no symptoms, it's you can really just ask the patient what their, sun exposure is likely to be and not have to test. That's one of the arguments against testing. But certainly, once you get down to those lower levels, and I'd say less than about 30, you're likely to start getting these vague symptoms which are associated with hypocalcemia of tiredness or weakness or cognitive problems and constipation, very subtle sort of symptoms. So, but I think that the clues clinically are really to do with, how much sunlight people get rather than their vague symptoms. They're very hard to pick clinically.
I think we need to take a pause and come back to go even deeper into this topic of vitamin D. And Ken, before you joined us, I told Travis I take my little espresso shots in the sun during my breaks during the working day. So I'll now also take my top off at the same time to capture more of this beautiful vitamin.
Thanks, Ken. It's been really interesting talking about vitamin D and all the associated testing that we need to do. But I often get this question a lot, and I'm interested in your answer. With vitamin D, should it always be done in conjunction because of the molecular pathways with, when you're requesting vitamin D, PTH and calcium? Are they important to test when testing vitamin D, or is it not useful?
I would generally say it's not useful. Vitamin D has had a sort of checkered history in measurement. It was very hard to measure in the past. It was one of our poorest assays, like plus or minus 20% CV. So just by measuring it, 100 times, the result might vary by, 30 or 40%. So there we needed other tests to confirm whether the vitamin D level was truly low or not. Nowadays, our vitamin D assays are much more precise. And so when we say the vitamin D level is 40, it's clearly less than 50. So you should be able to trust it without having the PTH and calcium to try to, support what's clearly a low vitamin D. The other thing about PTH is that it's not only changed by, the vitamin D level. But PTH rises in renal impairment. PTH rises with age. And so the interpretation of PTH is, introduces another complexity to vitamin D interpretation, an unwanted complexity. Calcium as well. Calcium levels are so broad in the population, like generally they're between about 2.15 millimoles and 2.55 millimoles. And everyone has their own set point. Like, you might be happy at 2.4 and I'll be happy at 2.25. And so when you're interpreting a vitamin D level and you've got a level of 2.25, which looks normal, well, that might be low for you because you're typically 2.4. Mm-hmm. So given all those complexities of PTH and calcium interpretation, I don't think they really add much to vitamin D depletion. And really, severe vitamin D deficiency is almost characterized by the fact that when you get to 12.5, everyone has a high PTH and a low calcium. So, it's a continuum, at a level of 45, hardly anybody has a high PTH and a low calcium. And it gradually increases as a continuum down to the bottom. So I don't really suggest all three of them should be measured. Vitamin D, if you measure it, if you need to measure it because the clinical history is vague, then it's enough as a screen.
Okay. So when we're looking at vitamin D deficiency, and this was something that surprised me in the research, is that there are now associated conditions with vitamin D deficiency, and we're getting a bit more research that's coming out about that. Can you tell us a bit more about the associated conditions with vitamin D deficiency?
Yeah. Look, I once told a government committee who was looking into vitamin D deficiency that there's only one disease that vitamin D deficiency causes, and that's the bone disease of rickets and osteomalacia. But it's been associated with almost every other disease you could imagine. The common diseases of diabetes and prediabetes and renal disease, and even it's been associated with increasing risks of malignancy, and it's just correlated with all-cause mortality. So now, nobody in their right mind would think that vitamin D deficiency is the cause of diabetes. But the way to look at it, and this is in our research with the AusDiab study, if you're vitamin D deficient, you're more likely to rapidly develop. So whatever the risk factors are for diabetes, obesity and inactivity and genetics, whatever, they're exacerbated in the presence of vitamin D deficiency. Now, that was an association, but scientific researchers found that, there are vitamin D receptors in muscle cells, with insulin action. There are not only vitamin D receptors in the islet cells that produce insulin, but the islet cells don't even want to rely on the kidney to 1-hydroxylate vitamin D. They will hydroxylate vitamin D on their own to generate the vitamin D that they need to function normally and be able to produce insulin normally. So all of these cells, virtually every cell in the body that's got this association has vitamin D receptors, and many of them have the ability to 1-hydroxylate. The other cells which are really important in terms of the 1-hydroxylation, immune cells, particularly macrophages and monocytes. So they can 1-hydroxylate. And people often know that sarcoidosis is a disease, the granuloma, sort of this massive immune cells. And the granuloma can cause vitamin D toxicity and hypercalcemia because it 1-hydroxylates sort of unregulated. So, these tissues really depend on vitamin D. Now, the vitamin D, if you link it, well, why do they need vitamin D? Well, calcium is an important intracellular regulator. So they want to really control their calcium levels. But, the vitamin D receptor really binds to many genes in the cell. And we're really just starting to sample these associations. So really, I think of it as like an accelerator. There are things that cause disease, but if you want to accelerate the development of the disease, you handicap those cells' physiology by depriving them of the normal homeostatic, pathways of vitamin D and calcium.
Okay. Now, one of the things that I've gone through with a number of the studies is there is a bit of mixed. So people say if it accelerates the disease process, if we replace it, then this should probably either prevent or at least hold it in a sort of holding pattern before the disease developments. But we got a bit of mixed results. And some say it's important, it's useful in glucose homeostasis for the first 6 weeks, but doesn't have an effect after 12 months. And some have tried to change and monitor insulin secretion and sensitivity. It's a bit mixed, but what's the best approach for the GP in this case regarding this information?
Just as I said that vitamin D doesn't cause diabetes or cancer or or autoimmune illness, which we haven't touched on, it also can't cure it. Now, can you put the disease in a holding pattern? Well, it depends on all those other factors, which are the true causes of the disease. Like if you give vitamin D to a diabetic and you don't modulate their weight and glucose and blood pressure and everything, well, the disease is going to progress. So vitamin D can't reverse the true causes, and it can't even stop the disease unless you address the underlying cause of the disease, but it will retard the progression. One of the most interesting things that I've seen with vitamin D is that vitamin D supplementation sort of slows the mitotic rates in malignancy, the doubling time of PSA and so on. It can't stop it. I mean, it's not a cure for malignancy. I wish it was, of course, but it just gives you time. And so in a way, I'd say that you should think about vitamin D with all of these conditions, but not as a cure, but as something that might buy you time to address those underlying causes, buy you a bit more time to address the underlying causes. Look, and teleologically, it's like, why? What the hell is going on with nature that vitamin D can make our body so lazy in fighting, disease? And it goes back to this sort of idea of, famine and, plenty, that, in the winter time when things are dark and food's less plentiful and life is tough, you preserve your resources and you don't upregulate immune function, you don't upregulate metabolic function, and you sort of slow everything down because you're waiting for the summer to come back again, so that you can have all of those vitamins and foods and everything again. And at that stage, you can get rid of those pre-malignant cells and you can fully, get rid of that infection in your limb or whatever. So it's sort of like, it's nature's message to the body to say, don't fight problems at the moment, you're saving your energy to survive. When the vitamin D comes back and it's a time of plenty, you can let loose and try to cure or battle disease. So I do this anyway. It's a bit teleological, as I said, but that's the only way to understand why it has such a all-pervasive effect on all these illnesses, and why does it associate with everything? It's just a reflection of the pattern of human existence over the millennia.
So then, if we do have someone who's, let's say, either moderate or severely deficient, what's the best management for that patient?
Look, this is a really interesting question, because I would have said, in the past, get your vitamin D above 50 at least, and if not above 75. And so if you're below 30, you need thousands of units to get you up there. If you're 50, you can get by with just the maintenance, 1,000 units a day to keep you up there. But I spoke to a colleague of mine from Adelaide, actually, now departed, Howard Morris, who's a researcher with Nordine and the calcium experts there. And he said to me, Ken, do you think, if we sort of retitrate our vitamin D to keep our vitamin D level at 50 all year round, do you think that's natural? Because nature intended us to have high vitamin D levels in the summer and let them free fall in the winter. And it really changed my thinking on that. And the studies that we've done on the, circannual variation in various cities of Australia. The idea with vitamin D is to get your vitamin D level up to, let's say, 75 in the summer and let it free fall to around 50 in the winter. And his point of view was that this natural cycling is also to do with the natural cyclings of bone. Like bone has its own cycle of formation and resorption. And it might be very important, a bit like gardening, to clear the garden and put in the fertilizer and let it grow in the season. So it might be very important to good bone growth to have this cycle. And so, from my point of view, if you're low in the winter, well, you better get it up because you're at risk of all those things. But ideally, the aim should be to get the vitamin D level up in the summertime. So if you're not exposed to vitamin D in the summer, take some supplements in summer and get it up to 75. And then don't worry about it in the winter. Once you're above 75, you won't fall to below 50 in the winter. And so that should be the aim of, but what dose do you need? Now, in the past, FDA and TGA sort of said, 1,000 units is enough, just take 1,000. 1,000 units is the maintenance dose. If you've got a level of 30 and you want to maintain it at 30, take 1,000 units. But if you want to get it above 30, you'll need to take at least 3,000 to 5,000 units for, the guidelines are 6 weeks or more. But it's very safe to take higher doses. 10,000 units doses have been proven to be safe. Even 50,000 unit doses have been shown to be safe. So you can get it up very quickly with, weekly 50,000s or I haven't looked closely at the research of the mega doses that they might give, once a year or something. But vitamin D toxicity is pretty damn rare.
Well, that leads into the next question, toxicity. So we're really not worried about toxicity. You can use it pretty safely.
No, that's a question for us in reporting, Travis, in the lab. So, we can say less than 75 in the summer, less than 50 in the winter, all of that stuff. But it's like, well, what's high? And it's very atypical for anybody that's above 125, unless they're a lifeguard on the beach in the summer, and they can get up to 150, 175 with their bronze bodies. Australians don't really get much above 125. So in a way, the natural level is 125. And most bone researchers say once you get above 125, we don't know whether in the long term it will be harmful. So ideally, I wouldn't be aiming for levels of 125. But even if you did go to above 125, what level will cause hypercalcemia is something like 450. And for that, you need to be taking tens of thousands of units every day. And the reason why it's so high is because of this 1-hydroxylation. You can take as much as you want. The kidney will stop hydroxylating it if it doesn't think it needs it. And so it's only once you get to 450 that 25-hydroxyvitamin D has some activity on its own. And if you have lots and lots of something that's mildly active, it'll become toxic without the 1-hydroxylation. But normally the 1-hydroxylation, switching off 1-hydroxylation completely protects you against vitamin D toxicity. So nobody really should be worried about, over-the-counter or prescribed vitamin D and causing. Look, people can freely buy vitamin D, and I know that some people who've been aiming to cure their cancers, I've seen them get vitamin D levels of 700 and hypercalcemia, but you really wouldn't get to anywhere near that level following medical advice.
So just the last question that I have, would you consider for high-risk populations then, even in summer, considering annual mega dose that get that level up just as a routine in summer for maybe nursing home residents? Would that be useful at all?
Yeah, well, that's the argument in a lot of places in the world, Travis. Why do we need to spend money on vitamin D measurement? We know nursing home patients are not getting enough sunlight. We know we need to get them up to 75, then could drop below 50 in the winter. So why not just give them those high doses and get them there? And don't even test whether you've got them there. You know that they're going to absorb the doses, especially if they're parenteral. So that's one of the arguments there. But, clinicians are sort of conservative by nature. We sort of like to know what we're treating, and we'd like to know how well we've treated it. So it's sort of hard to operate blindly and have that faith until we've had all of the studies that show that process over the long term is a safe and effective process. So, but it is one of the arguments. You can just give vitamin D. Personally, I get a bit of summer sunlight, but I'd like to be sure, and I do take 10,000 units a week in the summertime just to make sure that I'm there and I don't need to worry about it in the winter. So just one really last anecdote, if we've got time. I went to a talk once with some Sri Lankan doctors, and as I said before, darker skin, they've got diabolical problems when they migrate to dark places like Melbourne or Scandinavia, and they know the problems of osteoporosis, osteopenia with vitamin D deficiency. Anyway, I was talking about the summer sunshine and how you could burn, and one of the doctors said, we used to say to all mothers with newborn babies, take your baby out in the morning sun, in the sunlight. They won't get burnt, but they'll grow more strongly. And so, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And I was sitting next to an Australian GP and said, oh, isn't that interesting? There's some logic in all this thing about, getting enough sunlight but don't burn. Like the morning sun doesn't have much UV in it. And he said to me, Ken, we used to have infant child nurses in Australia, and they used to tell every mother the same thing.
Oh dear. Ken, before we do wind up, any final thoughts for GPs listening in regarding vitamin D?
Yeah, I think that most doctors aren't really surprised when low vitamin Ds come back. It's winter, the patient's inactive, they don't get much sunlight. It's never really surprising. So, it's such a simple thing to treat. And, whether it's just to help their bones, which categorically is a requirement, or whether it is just to make sure they've got ultimate health to fight those other comorbidities they might have. Be aware of your patient, their likely vitamin D deficiency. And we're fortunate that you can test if in doubt, but don't be scared of just prescribing it without testing if you know that it's true, and be confident that you're not going to cause toxicity by doing so. So I do think it's underestimated. Maybe one last thing, it's a personal thing. We touched on autoimmunity. Vitamin D deficiency is related to an increased risk of it doesn't cause autoimmunity, but you're more likely to develop autoimmunity if your immune system isn't intact and optimally active, and it needs vitamin D to do that. And the thing that I've got a daughter with type 1 diabetes, And I was looking at the literature on vitamin D and type 1, and I found a meta-analysis that said if you give vitamin D to the siblings of type 1 diabetics, their chance of getting type 1 diabetes is 30% lower, 30% lower. Like, that's enormous. Like, you can't prevent it. Like, type 1 diabetes is not a disease of vitamin D deficiency. But to be able to get a 30% improvement on a lifelong condition like that, it's sort of vital. It's really, I think that, anyone with strong histories of autoimmunity in particular, really, when you need that support of an intact immune system or intact surveillance system, there's really very little downside in taking vitamin D.
Well, on that note, I'm going to pop out for another topless espresso, and I'll take my vitamin D with me comfortably. Professor Ken Sikaris, thank you again for joining This Medical Life.
Pleasure, Steve. That's right.
And thank you, Dr. Travis Brown. See you next time.
Thank you.
This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.